find it kind of interesting that the game's anti-piracy statement is written in-universe. As such, it comes off as surprisingly threatening. And feel free to pause the video and give it a read if you'd like. Now, based on the number of guesses for Star Control 2 this week, I'm going to assume that not a huge number of you guys have played this game. Or those of you who have, guessed Star Control 2 because that's the game you would have preferred to see. Now, I do indeed own that game, so we will get to it eventually. But for today's Ancient DOS game, we're taking a look at a game that's 6 years older than it. Starflight. This game can easily be called one of the grandfathers of the space exploration genre as we know it, as it really does focus on the exploration aspect over everything else, but still has everything else you would potentially expect, like communicating with alien races, landing on planets to discover their secrets, and defending yourself against hostile encounters. The catch with Starflight is ultimately the technology it was built around. Making a game as expansive as this at such an early point in DOS gaming history was extremely ambitious. In fact, work on the game began as early as 1982, and is quoted on the box as taking over 15 man-years for this project to be completed. This kind of leads into some of the oddities regarding the technical aspects of this program, considering work on it started before any established norms were in place. And in the end, while the game was way ahead of its time, it was also kind of awkward to play, and it hasn't gotten any easier since. Once you get past its quirks though, it's actually still pretty fun, provided you have a few dozen hours to kill. Starflight was originally developed by Binary Systems and published by Electronic Arts in 1986, though there was a second release to add EGA support sometime between 1987 and 1989. Now, there seems to be a point of confusion on this re-release. While the boxes themselves have copyrights of 1989 on them, the game included shows a copyright of 1987. And the game files themselves have file dates in early 1988. So it's possible the EGA version was made early, then left to sit while the other ports were still in the works, so that all of them could be released simultaneously. That's just a theory though. What I can say for certain is you can tell the difference between the two versions depending on if there's EGA support or not, and physically, the re-release came in a box, while the initial release came in a sleeve. It's a one-player adventure game with support for 2-color Hercules, 4-color CGA, 16-color CGA Composite, 16-color Tandy, and 16-color EGA graphics, but only supports the PC speaker for audio. Now, in terms of which of those modes is best, the Tandy mode is probably the best if you've got actual hardware to run the game on, but emulated, you're actually better off using the CGA Composite color mode, as it will probably provide you the most natural feeling graphics for the gameplay. The Tandy mode has issues in DOSBox, which leads to everything black being light gray instead, and thus it looks really odd. As for the EGA mode, this mode has other issues and doesn't quite play the same way as the other modes, so it's best avoided. As for its current release date, it's still commercial but readily available from the Good Old Games website at www.gog.com along with its sequel for $6. For those of you who want a physical copy, I'm going to warn you right now, they are highly sought after as collector's items, and the cheapest you can expect to spend for any version other than the Sega Genesis version is around $50 for a complete copy of the original, more for the re-release, and you are not likely going to find copies that aren't being sold complete. This game really was one of the most popular of its time. The Genesis version, on the other hand, isn't exactly the same game. In fact, it's kind of an update of the game to be a little more action-oriented with more weapons and features and such, but ultimately just builds upon the original game without making any drastic changes. Copies of the Genesis version tend to go for around $5 to $20 depending on condition, and it is a good game in its own right. It's just never really reached the same collector status the original did, especially considering how much later it was released, with the Genesis version coming out a full 5 years after the original DOS version. The story for this game is actually extremely detailed, but part of the draw of the gameplay is uncovering the story as you go along, putting all the pieces together through the discoveries you make and through communications with alien races. To that end, very little is given in the manual and at the start of the game. The game itself starts late in the year 4619, where you and many other starship captains have been tasked by Interstel, the space organization of planet Earth, to explore the galaxy, searching for minerals to mine, life forms to learn about, as well as information regarding the old empire prior to the fall of Earth in 3480. However, very quickly into the game, scientists make a very disturbing discovery about the state of the sun in your home system, as solar flare activity is intensifying and will eventually incinerate Earth and everything on and around it. So you're given the secondary yet equally important task of logging new planets to settle down at in order to give humanity and all the alien inhabitants of Earth the best chance to expand and survive. You start the game in a starport orbiting planet Earth, with a number of areas you can access. And you can think of this starport as the main hub you'll return to as you progress to assess your status and prep for your next outing. Clockwise from the top, you have rooms for hiring and training crew members, a room for assigning crew members to various ship positions, the banking area so you can see a log of your expenses as well as any interest you've earned from money you haven't spent, a room for buying and selling ship components as well as conducting repairs, a room for buying and selling minerals, endurium fuel, and biological specimens, as well as for identifying any artifacts you come across, and finally, a room for checking your Interstel messages as well as evaluation reports regarding any planets you log as suitable for colonization, since if you log a planet unsuitable for colonization, you'll be penalized. When you're ready to leave, you can access the docking bay and return to your ship from the center of the screen. In terms of getting your crew ready, you have 6 positions to fill and technically 5 races to choose from for hiring crew members. Each new crew member will be fresh from the civilian population and thus will need plenty of training to fill the position you wish for them to fill. Of the races you can choose from, you have humans, who are all around average, the insect-like Velox, who are adept at combat but hard to train, the lizard-like Thrin, who are similar to humans but have surprisingly good communication skills, the plant-like Eloan, who are extremely talented and learn quickly, but are very frail. And finally, you can choose the staff androids, who can fill navigation and repair positions extremely well. But their pre-programmed nature precludes the ability to train them, so eventually you'll want to phase them out with actual crew members once you can afford to train them. One other thing to keep in mind when selecting your crew is that the Thrin and the Eloan are mortal enemies. When it comes to Interstel, they're willing to work together, but those you find out in the galaxy will be extremely offended if they detect their racial enemies among you. You may find yourself shifting crew members around a bit later in the game when you have to deal with particular races in order to avoid offending them. When assigning crew members, make sure you put the best crew member for the job in each slot. You can also opt to only have one crew member doing every single task, but this will greatly impact the efficiency of everything they do, and also means that if that crew member is injured, you're going to severely lose the ability to do much of anything. The captain position has no specific assigned task, but adds to the efficiency of every other task on the ship. So having a well-trained captain who isn't assigned to any other task can help out a little, though it isn't really that necessary. Before setting out, you also need to make sure your ship is well equipped. Now, Endurium is the fuel of the future, and having tons of the stuff is never a bad idea. But don't go overboard, since you're still going to need room in your cargo pods to store any minerals you mine up. In terms of your ship itself, having at least a few cargo pods early on is good, and you can max them out fairly quickly as you gain more money. The other things you can upgrade are your engines, shields, armor, missiles, and lasers. And the better engines allow for faster movement in combat and burn less fuel while in hyperspace. Shields, when raised, will constantly consume tiny amounts of fuel to provide a rechargeable barrier against enemy attacks in combat. Armor provides a static amount of protection and will need to be replaced eventually, plus stronger armor will have a negative effect on your combat speed due to its weight. Lasers and missiles are your weapons of choice, and you really want to make sure you have at least a laser system installed before you leave the solar system for your first time. Now once you're ready to leave, you're going to encounter the game's copy protection, and unlike a lot of games I've covered with copy protection in the past, I do believe this is the first one to show to use a code wheel. The code wheel included with Starflight is actually pretty simple to use, as the game gives you the names of a location, an artifact, and a race. And what you need to do is turn the code wheel to line up the location and artifact given, then look at the code window for the race, and you'll see the proper code printed. Inputting this code wrong is not recommended. The version of the game you can buy digitally nowadays has an external program where you just click everything in a list and it gives you the code. My only complaint about the copy protection in this game is you have to go through the process every time you leave the starport, which is probably why so many people who still have this game still have all the pieces of it, like the code wheel and such. The game is controlled almost entirely using the numeric keypad and the spacebar or enter keys. Using the spacebar or enter allows you to swap between moving your ship and interacting with the menu system where you can choose crew positions and issue orders. The captain makes all the decisions regarding landing, logging planets suitable for colonization, and keeping track of cargo. The science officer scans planets and ships and provides information and assessment about them. The navigator moves the ship, has access to a star map, and controls the shields and weapon systems. The engineer has the ability to assess damage and repair systems. The communications officer can hail ships as well as initiate distress signals if you're in really bad shape. And finally, the doctor is able to assess the health of crew members and can perform treatment on someone to heal them faster when necessary. In terms of when you're starting out, science and navigation are the two most important tasks, and you want to make sure your crew members are well trained at those positions. Communications is the next thing you'll want to worry about. Your engineer and doctor won't typically come into play until you start encountering alien races, so you can skimp on their training in the short run. Ultimately though, you'll want everyone fully trained in what they do so that there's few chances for mistakes. A poorly trained officer will do things either slowly, less accurately, or both. The bulk of the gameplay really does come down to exploration, as you'll be traveling around various solar systems looking for planets. When you first find a planet, you'll want to head for the middle of it to lock into orbit, at which point you can scan the planet and determine if it's worth logging for colonization, or possibly landing on to find minerals and such. You also want to make sure it's safe to land on a planet, and keeping careful note of its gravity, its predominant surface, and the weather conditions. Planets with extremely high gravity, molten or gaseous surfaces, or violent weather patterns are typically unsuitable to safely land on, much less explore. When landed on the planet, you'll use a special exploration vehicle to get around, which will typically be linked back up to your ship via a transponder, so you can find your way back. You'll need to pay careful attention to your map as well as to the weather conditions. Bad weather conditions, including extreme temperatures, can injure crew members and mask your transponder signal, not to mention reduce your energy efficiency, thus burning more fuel with each move that you make. You have a huge number of options to select from, and for the most part, it's pretty self-explanatory what all of them do. The one thing that may take a moment to figure out is that you mine minerals and pick up items simply by moving close to them, going to your cargo screen, then selecting them from the list that appears, as the list shows you not only what's in your cargo bay, but also what's on the ground around you. While most ship functions burn a tiny amount of fuel, hyperspace travel is where most of your fuel will be lost. To enter hyperspace, all you have to do is leave the system, at which point you'll be able to access your star map and can decide where to go from there. A good place to start would be the plus-shaped pattern of stars to the southwest, though I recommend having some weapons before you do. In fact, you'll want to spend a good chunk of time building yourself up in your own solar system before setting out towards the rest of the galaxy. Sooner or later, though, you're going to run into alien races. When communicating with alien vessels, you can choose one of 3 different postures: friendly, hostile, or obsequious, which is essentially the same as groveling. Certain races respond better to certain postures, though it's safe to assume a hostile posture will often just lead to combat, with a few exceptions. You also have the ability to ask questions or make statements. Making statements will have a direct effect on how well a race treats you, while asking questions typically goes better or worse depending on how the race presently feels about you. The races which comprise your crew will also have an effect, as will any prior combat encounters you've had. Now, if an encounter goes well, or at least okay, the ships that engaged you will fly off and out of range. Flying out of range of anything is basically how you leave an encounter. When diplomacy fails, though, combat begins. The combat system is incredibly simple, as you pretty much only have control over moving and shooting. You don't actually have a choice over whether missiles or lasers are fired, as the game will choose the best weapon depending on range, as missiles work better at long range than lasers. About the only things to keep in mind with the combat system, beyond remembering to raise shields and arm weapons, is that some enemies are immune to lasers or missiles, but never both. Plus, when you destroy an enemy, you can access the debris field much the same way you would mine minerals on a planet, thus getting lots of stuff in the process, most notably endurium fuel. And if you need to escape from combat, just run away from the enemies and put enough distance between you and them so that you fly out of range. However, if you don't have very good engines or have loaded up really heavy armor, this might not be possible to do. And that's essentially the bulk of the gameplay. There's lots of information to find and planets to explore, plus there's artifacts to find along the way, and you'll often get coordinate details you want to write down to find interesting and unique things. Fortunately, the game gives you a log system, so you can actually write information into it, but oftentimes you'll be better off just keeping a pen and paper handy. Now, because of how old this game is, there's a number of quirks to it that may be a bit tricky to get used to. And the number one quirk that can be really odd is how saving and loading works. The game tracks a massive amount of data, at a time when people didn't often have 640 kilobytes of RAM and disks didn't hold more than 360 kilobytes of data. So in order to deal with this situation, the game actually saves details about its state into the executable data itself. It even says on the cover that you'll need 2 blank disks when you play this game. The reason for this is because the game needs to make a copy of itself elsewhere, since you play the copy of the game so it can modify itself as you play along. Then when you want to save your progress for later, you need a second disk to save a copy of the present executable state too. Now, this quirk of storing game progress in the executable data has both a pro and a con. The pro is that you can save your progress in almost any moment, anywhere in the game. The con, however, is that if you quit the game without performing a proper save and shutdown, any attempt to run the game following will fail because the executable data will be incomplete, lacking some of the on-the-fly information that's stored in RAM as you go along. It's extremely weird that the game works like this, but given the amount of data it's expected to handle for the time period, I do have to say it's a rather interesting way of getting around those limitations. There's 3 batch files included as well to simplify the process of storing a save game onto another disk, retrieving a save game from that disk, and resetting the state of the game to the default starting state from the original disks. As for the other quirks, they're all pretty much just minor. One of the more unusual of them is that when scrolling through the cargo lists, you don't scroll the cursor over top of the list. You scroll the list itself underneath the cursor. So to move down the list, you press up, and to move up the list, you press down. Which is kind of weird since everything else for selecting things works as expected, but oh well. Movement is also handled using a default BIOS keyboard handler, which means when you press a key, you'll often just move once, wait for a fraction of a second, then move repeatedly. This also means that you can't hold more than one key down at a time. For most parts of the gameplay, this isn't too bad, but for anything combat related, it can be a bit tricky to get used to. Speaking of the movement, one thing I find very odd is that you can move diagonally almost everywhere, except when walking around the starport. Pressing diagonal directions in the starport will move you either horizontally or vertically, but not both at the same time. The final quirk I want to note is that you can often repeatedly find items and minerals multiple times from special locations, simply by landing nearby, picking the stuff up, launching back into space, landing, picking stuff up, launching, landing, etc., repeating as many times as you want. It's boring to do this, but when you can pull this off with something like a source of endurium, you may just want to do so to jumpstart all of your stats. While Starflight hasn't aged too well, it's actually still surprisingly fun to play given its quirks and limitations. But it really is a massive time sink. As you may be able to tell from my gameplay footage, I wasn't really able to get all too far because you need to spend many hours on end exploring the galaxy in this game to actually make any decent progress. As such, this game will probably appeal best to those of you who really enjoy the whole space exploration concept, or just want to see how early space exploration games worked, as many of the games which came after this one clearly drew inspiration from here. Those of you not really into space exploration games, or those of you looking for more action and less adventure, will probably want to stick to other titles. Now, setting this game up in DOSBox is simple enough, but a little quirky, just like the game itself. You need to set a fixed cycles count to keep certain aspects of the game from going ludicrously fast, and to that end, I recommend 1500 cycles. Now, some aspects of the game actually do work better at higher cycles counts, but then it makes certain other aspects go too fast, so 1500 seems to be the best balance. To get the CGA Composite color mode working, all you have to do is set the machine type to CGA. And you'll probably want to do that with DOSBox, but on real hardware, you're either going to want to use the Tandy mode if possible, or EGA if you have no choice. And don't forget to select the composite display type too when you start the game up this way. Anywho, that's all for this episode of Ancient DOS Games. Stay tuned for episode 142, where I'll be taking a look at an adventure game that starts you off beating someone up with their own dismembered arm. Yeah, it's probably going to be a mature-rated episode. In any case, send your guests to adg@pixelships.com and make sure to tune in next Saturday to check it out. Also, I have an extra special video going up in just a couple days on Monday, so be sure to check that out too.